Good morning and welcome back. My name is Dan Carpenter. I'm the Alias Freed Professor of Government in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, and I also direct the social sciences and the academic ventures here at Radcliffe. We're about to start our second panel entitled Borders, Boundaries, and Belonging. And we have our three panelists here today. We actually have four panelists listed on the program. Very sorry to say that for personal reasons, Grayson Martinez cannot be with us today, and we're all very saddened about that. Let me introduce the moderator of our panel, Ambassador Samantha Power. Ambassador Power is the Anna Lindh Professor of the Practice of Global Leadership and Public Policy at Harvard's Kennedy School, and is also a professor of practice at Harvard Law School. She is a former United States permanent representative to the United Nations and was a member of President Obama's cabinet. Before joining the U.S. government, she was the founding executive of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy, again at the Kennedy School, and among her many writings, many of you will recognize her famous Pulitzer Prize-winning book, A Problem from Hell, America and the Age of Genocide. We're very honored to have her and our other panelists with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I was supposed to have the easiest job here today, which was just to introduce our panelists and moderate the discussion. But because, as you'll hear, the emphasis of the other panelists is on other parts of the world, I've been asked at the last minute, given the unfortunate absence of the person who was to be our third panelist, who's a tremendous immigration rights activist and organizer here in this country. I've been asked to speak a little bit at the last minute to some of the immigration and citizenship issues as they relate to the United States. So I'm going to do that very briefly. But before I do that, it gives me great pleasure to give you a preview of the more substantive presentations that we'll be getting from two extraordinary panelists. Sarah Leah Whitson is the executive director, as you know from your program, of Human Rights Watch Middle East and North Africa's division. And she is going to speak about the changing landscape for women's rights in the Middle East. She will focus, I think, very specifically on a country that's been a lot in the news of late in terms of the steps that it has taken regarding women. I will leave that country nameless and leave you in suspense. But many of us have, as we have read news reports out of this very large oil-producing country in the Middle East, we have wondered, is this real? And what does it actually mean for the women on the ground who have been denied their rights and continue to be denied their rights and have been for so long? She's also excitingly going to use film, I think, to bring home the human stakes of the issues that she's describing here. After Sarah, we will hear from Nilüfer Göle, who's a professor of sociology. And she's going to discuss, as I understand it, Muslim women in Europe, focusing on the ideas very much at the heart of this conference, ideas about crossing borders, challenging concepts of belonging amid vast demographic shifts. And I think she's going to focus on the issue of veiling, asking whether belonging to a country requires one to embrace the shared norms that have existed in that country. And I think is intrigued, it sounds like from her work, at looking at how various identities are negotiated. Identities related to faith, related to gender, related to politics, how one negotiates all those in one being and in one society. So I just, before handing off to our two speakers, will make four very brief points about the United States and issues related to immigration of the themes of this panel. And this is not an area on which I'm an expert, but just some food for thought. And I know that within the audience, we have vast amounts of expertise, and I really hope that we can move relatively briskly to the discussion, which will be very, very rich. So the first point I wanted to make is to state the obvious, which is that currently the concept of citizenship in the United States is a more and more contested one. I think some of the reflexive understandings of what it meant to be American, what the identity of this country was, the standing of the Statue of Liberty as a relatively uncontroversial icon, speaking to those elements of American identity, all of that feels much more up for grabs than it has certainly in my lifetime. And I should say that I'm an immigrant to this country. I came when I was 9 from the country of Ireland. So we have people in very important offices in this land, including arguably the most important office, creating more exclusionary identities, narrower identities, sort of shrinking the conception of Americanness, and elevating very specific groups of Americans to a kind of privileged, almost normative status, it feels like. And to me, that's, of course, very, very worrying. This is happening not only through tweets and, again, people contesting rhetorically conceptions of citizenship and Americanness, but also kind of in the capillaries of the US government. And the most vivid example of this, I think, at least lately, came just a couple months ago when the federal agency that issues green cards and grants citizenship to people from foreign countries in this great country, the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, who many of us who've come to this country have had to sort of process our applications through. Until very recently, the USCIS mission statement said that its aim was to secure, quote, America's promise as a nation of immigrants, end quote. Like, again, a very uncontroversial statement. But several months ago, it dropped that characterization. And so now it turns out, at least according to the mission statement of this agency, which has such a vital role, the mission statement or the mission of the agency is no longer to cultivate the United States as a, quote, nation of immigrants, end quote. The second point I want to make, which might seem a little off topic, but I think is extremely important as we think about the future of this country and the future, I think, of democracy and inclusion and pluralism around the world, is that political party identification in the United States is at its most vehement, and you might even say virulent, pitch at present. And why is this relevant for discussions of citizenship and Americanness and boundaries and belonging? Because right now, the biggest predictor of where one is likely to fall on some of the key identity issues and policy issues is simply what is your political party. And I just want to throw out a few, I think, very disturbing statistics, but I think that will feel familiar to you. In 1960, only 5% of Americans said that they would be upset if their child married someone in the other political party. That was 5%. In 2010, 49% of Republicans and 33% of Democrats said that they would be mad. That was 8 years ago. And for reasons I don't really understand, but it may have to do with not wanting to know the answer, that question has not been polled since 2010. And so all we have now, all I can offer you to try to capture the zeitgeist of the moment is, according to Pew last year, only 9% of Republicans and 8% of Democrats say their spouse is a member of the other political party. But to put this the salience of political identity in some broader context, and arguably, to offer some good news, 88% of Republicans and 94% of Democrats today have no problem with interracial marriage. So inter-party marriage, like, forget about it. But interracial marriage, we've made at least some strides, significant strides. And on same-sex marriage, while it's true, 74% of Democrats favor same-sex marriage. I would have thought that was even higher. But, and it's true that only slightly half of Republicans favor same-sex marriage. But the support for same-sex marriage in the GOP has tripled over the last decade, and I think we can expect those numbers to continue to cascade in the right direction. So we're now in this weird world where the salience of our political identities, feels more important than our shared status, let's say, as parents or as siblings or as citizens. And what does that mean for the discussion that we'll be having and for issues of identity? Third point, because I was asked very specifically to speak to this because it's so in the news and so heartbreaking, but in part, I think because of this more virulent forms of what Cass Sunstein, professor at the law school, happens to be my husband, has introduced this term partyism, which I think is a sort of speaks to the sort of ideology of partyism. But with partyism and the widening divisions between the two mainstream parties here, it's even harder to get agreement on key immigration policy issues. And so Exhibit A of that right now is what you all know as the DACA program. So the DACA program, DACA stands for Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. I'm no expert on DACA. We were going to have a great expert on DACA on the panel. Maybe there are people in the audience who want to speak more to this when we open it up. But what a heartbreaking situation we find ourselves in here. Not only because there are 800,000 people who came to this country before they were 16 years old and received this protected status and now are living in terror associated with living in limbo. It is true that for now, the Department of Homeland Security is saying that these people will not be deported, but it is also the case that their status, their protected status, is expiring. Every month, some new batch in the 800,000, their status expires. And what happens when your status expires? Your ability to get a work permit dramatically diminishes. And to give you a sense, again, and all of this is in the news and most of you are familiar with it, but this is a population, those who had been DACA recipients, that are 90% of whom are employed or in school. So very embedded, completely embedded given when many of them came. The average age in which this population came to the United States, according to the recipients who were surveyed, was 6.5 years old. And we've all seen the stories about 3-month-olds and 2-year-olds and so forth who've never even been to the country that they're at risk of getting deported to. Now, why is this Exhibit A of the political challenges associated with these debates? Because this is actually something that polls well across party lines. Now, unfortunately, each month that we go without accord, the polling gets slightly worse. But as of January of this year, 87% of Americans supported giving protected status, maintaining basically this program to the Dreamers, as they're called. And there's another 1 million people apparently who are eligible for this program who are not actually in the program, also at risk of deportation right now as we speak. But of that 87%, that was, as of January, 79% Republicans and 92% of Democrats. And those polls are going up on the Democratic side and a little bit down on the Republican side, but still well within reach. And yet, even on this relatively non-controversial issue of immigration, never mind a big, comprehensive package of reforms that are actually needed in this country to give people the ability to live in security and in dignity and to get the balance right in terms of open borders, but also being a nation of immigrants and caring for vulnerable people around the world. Getting that balance right requires functional institutions that can actually cooperate on issues around which especially you have what passes for a domestic political consensus. And yet, Trump announced the end of the program on September 5th last year, gave a deadline until March 5th. There have been now 6 bipartisan proposals that have come to him, and he has rejected all of them, including one that would have given him $25 billion for his wall. So go figure. But if we can't reach agreement on an issue like that where there's still relative consensus in the main, it's going to be extremely challenging to get any kind of, to reaffirm at least even the notion of Americanness, even if it was always something observed, in the breach and not consistently applied across time. But now we even have divisions again on what it means to be American. My last point, before opening it up to our experts, is just to make the again, very, very obvious point about the importance of politics in all of this. And it's challenging because, as you see even in the controversy now associated with the census, when you live in fear, when you are not made to feel fully American or a welcome member of our society, the instinct is to lay low and to stay out of politics and to not be somebody who puts your head up. And yet what we, of course, all need to do is mobilize on behalf of our brothers and sisters. And here, for all of the bad news, that some of which I have spoken to, in terms of our polarization, in terms of our inability to get things done in order to improve the lives of people who are living in our midst and are integral to our country and our communities, the activation that the denial of these rights and the stripping of the dignity of so many individuals, the activation that is happening in response to that is a sight to behold. And I think, I want to close, just these opening comments by bringing us back to Louis Brandeis's great line, which is that the most important office in any democracy is not that of president, but that of citizen. And those of us who have the privilege of being able to live as citizens, not in the shadows, we also have a responsibility to look out for those who are living in very, very difficult, dark circumstances right now. It is our responsibility to exercise the privilege of citizenship on behalf of those who need support and solidarity. So with that, touching on America as best I can, despite being a foreign policy person, I will now turn the floor over to Sarah, and we're very much looking forward to hearing about that unnamed country where a few things have been happening lately. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. And it's interesting that here in 2018, the topic of women in the Middle East is actually one of the few sources of good news coming from the region. Although women in the Middle East face some of the worst systemic discrimination in the world, we've seen so many advances with respect to women's rights, not just since the 2011 uprisings, but really in the past 2 decades. And indeed, despite the chaos and catastrophe of so many wars in the region, where countries are not in war, we've seen so much progress, primarily in the realm of legislation designed to end discrimination against women or create protections for them from violence and labor abuse. Most recently, Lebanon, Jordan, and Tunisia abolished the infamous Marry Your Rapist laws, which allows a rapist to avoid jail if he marries his victim. Tunisia allowed women to pass nationality to their children, becoming the 8th country in the region to allow women to do this. Qatar approved a law that allows children born to Qatari women and non-Qatari fathers to at least obtain residency rights and identification. Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria passed domestic violence laws. And Kuwait, Qatar, the UAE, and Morocco passed domestic worker laws. These are just the most recent. There are many more examples. There are ongoing campaigns across the region on these and other discriminatory laws, and I expect we'll see further advances as women redefine their status as citizens, not subjects, who have and demand the same rights as women across the world. The cultural exceptionalism, religious exceptionalism arguments are just not persuasive to the female or male youth bulge in these countries. First, before I get to the main topic of the country that hasn't been named, I want to focus on 2 areas of very positive development, which I think really touch on the theme today of borders and nationality as they affect gender issues. As I mentioned, the nationality laws are a topic of renewed interest, particularly with Tunisia's recent law allowing women to pass nationality to their children, as well as to end the decree that banned or prohibited Muslim women from marrying non-Muslim men. Most recently, in February, the Arab League, for the first time, passed a resolution that calls on member states to, and I'm quoting, end all forms of discrimination in nationality and to take concrete steps to amend laws and legislation relating to nationality in order to grant women and men equal rights in conferring nationality to their children and spouses and to acquire, change, or retain nationality. This is a very big deal because, as I mentioned, only 7, now 8 of 20 Arab states allow women to pass nationality on to their children. Algeria, Egypt, Morocco, Tunisia, and Yemen, which have always been among the most progressive with respect to women's rights, all provide equal rights to women and men to confer citizenship to their children. Iraq, remnant from the Ba'athist era secular laws, and Mauritania also allow women with foreign husbands to confer nationality to their children if they're born in the country. But for the rest, what this means is that children, and there are millions of them, born to women, born to citizen women married to non-nationals, do not obtain citizenship or nationality, and in many cases don't have even residency or rights in the state where they live. So they can't work, they can't study, they can't travel, and so forth. In Israel, this is enforced through a so-called family reunification law, which is actually a family division law, that prevents spouses from the occupied territories or states identified as enemies, like Lebanon and Syria, from living in Israel. In contrast, Jewish foreign spouses get automatic citizenship. Now, one justification for this is a security one, because naturally, spouses from the occupied Palestinian territories are potential terrorists and threats. But the real excuse for these nationality laws throughout the region are, in fact, demographic and political in nature, to prevent, for example, an increase in the number of Palestinians in Jordan or Lebanon or Israel, because that would disrupt the demographic balance. Because if all the children of national Jordanian or Lebanese or Israeli women married to Palestinian men had nationality, that would bring a spike in the population of this undesirable nationality. Particularly in Jordan, the argument is really not persuasive at all, given that the law permits a Jordanian man to marry as many as 4 women. So a Jordanian national can marry 4 Palestinian women, have all their children, including foreign nationals, and pass on citizenship to all of the wives and children. But the Jordanian woman can't do that. The discriminatory system really just ties into a very entrenched patriarchal culture, mostly about social control and controlling women and controlling who women can marry, preventing them, discouraging them from marrying foreign husbands. And so really is about family, tribal, local community control over women. The Gulf countries are a particular problem because not only do they not grant nationality to these children, they also don't allow them to have dual nationalities. So the result is that children born to GCC mothers and non-GCC fathers, or not from that state, are effectively stateless. Some countries, like Jordan, have put in laws to grant at least certain benefits to non-citizen children instead of allowing them to gain nationality through their mothers. As I mentioned, most recently, Qatar approved a law that allows children born to Qatari women and non-Qatari fathers to at least obtain residency rights and identification cards. But these half-baked measures don't work, and they continue to relegate children in such situations to second-class status. This month, in a couple of weeks actually, we'll launch a new report in Jordan documenting how the 355,000 stateless children of Jordanian mothers married to non-Jordanians, mostly Palestinian, but also Egyptian, Iraqi, and so forth, don't even benefit from the proposed minimal protections. Jordanian authorities restrict the rights of these children to work, own property, travel to and from Jordan, enroll in higher education, and get government health care and other services. The 2014 decision that was purported to ease these restrictions has completely fallen short of expectations, and people who are even supposed to be able to get ID cards can't get them. We're working very closely with women's rights activists in Jordan to a joint campaign to lobby on these laws because we think Jordan is the next best place to get these laws overturned. But we know it will be a tough slog. I should note that Qatar's recent change of granting residency to children born to non-Qatari fathers was very much precipitated by the crisis in the country due to the siege imposed by neighboring GCC states. So in this case, it was the security crisis that actually created a motivation and an impetus for the government to allow women to have their children get at least residency. Because stateless children born in Qatar were required under the laws of Saudi and UAE and Bahrain to return to their father's national country and had no residency rights in Qatar. We're very hopeful that we will persuade Qatari authorities in this moment of crisis to actually solve this problem by allowing Qatari women to pass nationality on to their children. A second area of women's rights issues that touches on the intersection of borders and national identity, quite interestingly, is the status of migrant domestic workers. The biggest population of migrant workers in the Middle East are not construction workers, but actually migrant domestic workers, housemaids. 3 to 4 million of them, almost entirely women, almost entirely in the Gulf, but also prevalent in Lebanon and Jordan. 10 years ago, these workers had no protection, virtually no protection, and we made exposing abuses against migrant domestic workers a major priority of our work. Including, for example, the confiscation of their passports, the fact that they owed $1,000 in recruiting fees, the fact that they couldn't leave their employers, the fact that they were locked in their homes, not allowed to leave, couldn't make phone calls, and lived as virtual slaves in their owners' homes. And I didn't use that term accidentally. That is how they were perceived by the law, so that a domestic worker who fled her employer was considered absconding, running away, because she was owned by her sponsor, and her legal presence in the country is bound completely by her sponsor, who is the employer. These are primarily South Asian women, now increasingly East African women in Arab countries who speak little to no Arabic. So in fact, for many years, it was very difficult for us to get women's rights organizations in the Middle East to see the problem of migrant domestic workers as a woman's problem. One of the ways we took on the issue was, for example, making videos that showed Kuwaiti women or Lebanese women dressed in maid costumes so that they could try to identify with the situation of these migrant domestic workers and literally stand in their shoes. It was also a challenge because most of the actual abuse, in many cases even physical abuse, was happening at the hands of essentially women bosses in the household. But rights for migrant workers, migrant domestic workers, as employees, as laborers, not as property, was also very much seen as a security issue by the governments, in that granting them rights as workers suggested granting them rights as residents and could make their migrant status permanent. We did continue to work to chip away at these perceptions, and slowly the laws have started to change, and really started to change. First, the government started passing model contracts that regulated the number of hours a migrant worker could work a day, that allowed for time off and breaks during the day, that paid overtime. These were completely foreign concepts. The notion that a migrant domestic worker could have a day off. Employers would say they didn't want her to have a day off because that would mean she would leave the house and get a boyfriend and have sex, and that's why she shouldn't have a day off. But as these evolved, soon we were able to persuade governments to actually pass migrant domestic worker laws that again regulated the status of these workers, the hours, the pay, and so forth. And leading up to the best law of all, which was Jordan's, which actually just put migrant domestic workers to be covered by the regular, normal labor law, which, by the way, even US and UK law don't do. Migrant domestic workers are not covered by the labor law that applies to all other workers. So this was soon followed, as I said. Now Bahrain passed a migrant domestic worker law, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Morocco, Qatar, and the UAE. Didn't do it voluntarily, they were pushed. And now Lebanon and Oman, surprisingly, disappointingly Lebanon, are the only two remaining outliers with large migrant worker populations that have no domestic worker regulations. So it is an area of interesting, I hate to use the word, but I will, intersection between women and their nationality and their gender identity and how that determines what they see as women's issues. But what I really want to focus my remarks on today is how Human Rights Watch, as a Western, albeit international, as we keep telling people, human rights organization, have pursued women's rights advocacy in partnership across the borders with women activists and women's rights organizations in the region as a model for, I hope, how we can overcome some of the challenges that any advocacy on women's rights in the Muslim world or Arab world often faces. That this sort of advocacy, that this notion of rights are Western imposition, that they're colonial, that they're imperialist. And I want to delve into our work on Saudi Arabia, surprise, where we've invested over a decade of research and advocacy to tackle the so-called guardianship system in the country, as well as a host of other measures in the country that segregate and exclude women from normal life experiences and opportunities. So yes, Saudi Arabia has attracted a great deal of attention following dramatic announcements from the new king and the now famous young crown prince. This week is on the cover of Time magazine, promising significant reforms for women's rights and inclusion. The government's promise to reform aspects of its guardianship system, allow women to drive, open up job sectors previously excluded to women, allow women to attend sporting events, implement sports education for girls, and further limit the power of religious police who have for decades harassed, attacked, and beaten women for perceived morality crimes like bad hijab. We have yet to see these promised reforms materialize, but the circumstances that led to the government prioritizing these reforms didn't happen overnight. As I think every woman activist here knows, the governments take credit for these things, but it's a long, hard slog of women's work for many, many years that produces change. And Saudi women activists have been fighting for many years to challenge what is undoubtedly the most regressive regime of the region, and face terrible repression and persecution, including long jail sentences as a result. So this also follows, as I said, a decade of research and advocacy from Human Rights Watch on every aspect of the newly promised reforms. In 2008, we produced our first report on the guardianship system, which, in case you don't know, requires every woman to have a male guardian, a father, a brother, a husband, even a son, no matter how old she is, who has the authority to make a range of critical decisions on her behalf, including whether she can apply for a passport, travel outside the country, study abroad on government scholarship, get married, or leave prison. Saudi women regularly face difficulty, if not the impossibility, of conducting a range of transactions, from renting an apartment to filing a legal claim, even to obtaining medical treatment, without a male relative's consent or presence. So our first report on this subject in 2008 was path-breaking, at least for us, I think, and people who work in this, because it was the first time to document the voices and testimonies of Saudi women, Saudi children, Saudi families in Arabic on how the guardianship system was affecting their lives. So this wasn't us telling everybody in Saudi Arabia what's wrong with the guardianship system. It was Saudi women talking about how this system was ruining their lives. Including, for example, a woman who was unable to get a hysterectomy, which she urgently needed because her male guardian would not consent. In part, in response to this and the sort of international attention it brought, the government made promises at the Human Rights Council, first in 2009, then in 2013, to abolish the guardianship system. At the same time, of course, they were saying that they didn't have a guardianship system and that what they had was a system where women could do a lot of things except when they needed protection from a male guardian who was only trying to protect her. But they eased and soon abolished most of the labor law restrictions that required male permission to work, but they did little to nothing to sanction employers that continued to require it. In education, various universities started to abolish the guardian permission requirement. In 2014, divorced women were allowed to register their children in schools before they couldn't. In 2016, divorced or widowed women without a guardian, could obtain their own identity cards, which was necessary to access any social service. We turned to sports next because we thought the moment was ripe with Saudi joining the 5-member Olympic Commission for the 2012 Olympics. And we focused on the exclusion of women from the Saudi Olympic delegation and pressured them to finally include Saudi women in their team in the 2012 Olympics, as well as to promise to allow girls sports education in schools, previously not allowed in public schools because it might, in the words of one Saudi cleric, damage their virginity. But Saudi women watching Saudi athletes on television at the London Olympics, waving the Saudi flag, said it was the happiest day in their lives to see themselves represented on an international scale. So in 2016, we decided to launch an update to highlight these reforms, but also wanted to really push to eliminate this guardianship system in its entirety. We launched an 80-page report and 3 short videos, which you'll see later, that aimed at highlighting the continued application of this discriminatory system. But this time, more than any prior time, we decided to partner very, very closely with a number of incredible Saudi women activists and influential commentators, because we wanted to be persuasive, we wanted to be effective, we wanted people in Saudi Arabia to actually hear us and not just hear voices that we scripted, but hear issues in a narrative that was persuasive locally. And so we consulted with these activists and commentators on every aspect of our research and advocacy. The videos, the recommendations in the report, and the strategy we were going to use to ensure that the report got traction in Saudi Arabia itself. So for example, we originally demanded as a recommendation in our report a complete end to sex segregation, particularly in the workplace where this is a huge problem. But our Saudi partners advised against it. So instead, we asked the Ministry of Labor to abolish registries of companies that don't sex segregate. It was a more modest ask, but it was one that they felt would effectively address much of their problem. It would end the stigmatization of employers that did not segregate. Saudi activists spent hours working with us on the videos and went back and forth on specific details about what would make it seem authentic to a Saudi audience, what the hashtag should be, what the tagline should be, and we agreed it would be "Together to End Male Guardianship." We interviewed Saudi businesswomen, artists, and commentators to see what narrative they thought would be most effective in the videos. And we spent months teeing up the report and the videos with prominent commentators. Saudi Arabia has the deepest Twitter saturation rate pro capita in the world. Large groups on Telegram and Facebook, asking them to put their own spin on the issue, on the report, on the commentary. So I want to play these very short videos for you now so you get a flavor of how we tried to communicate on this issue.
شوفي، أحسن شيء تقدري تسويه تتصالحي مع زوجك.
هي جابت لنا العار، مستحيل اخليها ترجع البيت.
So together, the videos garnered 2.5 million views on Facebook and 270,000 more on YouTube within the first 72 hours of their release. Our hashtag campaign, Together to End Male Guardianship. A little help in the slide. Got it? Yeah. Inspired Saudi activists to launch their own grassroots campaign 2 weeks after our report launched. And that was Saudi women, clicking here. Saudi women to demand an end to guardianship. Every day they would add a number, 1, 2, 3, to track each day as their campaign went on. It was trending for 3 months in a number of videos and social campaigns. In a number of the videos, our report's recommendations were copy-pasted as the campaign's demands, which was pretty incredible. Activists had a sense of ownership over the campaign and tweeted it and shared it, as I mentioned. The hashtag is still circulating, apparently even graffitied on walls in Saudi Arabia. The posted personal testimonials online, made their own videos, including a music video, which I wish I could play with you, which had 20 million views, created and distributed their own I Am My Own Guardian bracelets, organized the sending of 2,500 messages and a 15,000 signature petition to the king, asking him to dismantle the guardianship system, and the petition was only in Arabic. I think that was it. They wrote articles creating the system and created art. This is Miss Safa, a Saudi artist who made T-shirts, murals, and images that became the unofficial symbol of the campaign and which she released to the public domain. The stickers then stuck around. Done. Saudi activists, writers, and academics came out saying women deserve more independence for men. Even though the Grand Mufti critiqued the campaign, other religious officials soon said that actually women should be equal. Run out of time here, so maybe in the Q&A I can tell you a little bit about the current status of the promised reforms. They're still mostly promises. But the risks for women activists remain heightened, and the campaign has not been cost-free. Just one example, women activists received phone calls before the announcement about women driving, telling them not to speak publicly about the end of the driving ban, because the narrative is that this is a government initiative and that only the government can be an agent of change. That's completely false. Thank you
so much, Sarah. That was excellent. I know, but it was 25 minutes, so that's good. Nilüfer.
I jump, okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for letting me also to join the conversation. Now the word conversation is loaded since the last panel, so I was wondering if I have the courage. Is this majority? What is it? It's every time for a person or for a woman, it's hard to join the conversation, to synchronize our words and perspectives. So I will be speaking about Muslim women, but in European contexts, which is different because where there is freedom, where state doesn't take control over the public life. I think this is the difference maybe that I pursue with you, how the public sphere is free and it becomes a very important place of encounter between Muslim women and others. This will be the kind of, the realm in which I'm going to situate my talk. And the question that will lead my talk will be, do we have to share the same norms to belong? I think this is just a simple question, but quite complicated, that I'm trying to not answer, but at least raise, because I think that's what is going on in European context. The question of difference, this time difference religious and cultural, because it's hard to make the definition of Islamic presence in Europe. Is it about religion? Is it about culture? It's both. It is, I would say, it is not properly addressed since the last 20 years, we can see that the controversies around Islam are debated in a way that has not provided societies with frames of thinking this difference. That will be maybe the end result, which changes or endangers the pluralistic democracies itself. So this is the frame of my talk. So the Islamic presence is basically framed as a problem, and we put together many different problems together. That is refugee crisis. It became a crisis situation. Refugee crisis, jihadist terrorism, and Muslim migrants living in European countries, already second, third generation, as citizens. So the question of citizenship are not related in the same way to these three groups. And very often we make this amalgam, as the French would say, the identification between these three problems that are quite distinct, that also overshadows the ordinary Muslims living in these countries. The word ordinary is also quite a paradox, because you cannot be ordinary if you become visibly Muslim. And that is the real issue today, how you become a citizen, ordinary citizen, but when you are visibly Muslim, that creates some problems, tensions, conflicts, and even laws at the end of the day. So basically, I'm thinking about Muslim fate in post-migratory phase. I say post-migratory because they themselves, the youth living in European cities, doesn't want to be identified as people of migrant origin. It is important because we identify them as coming from migrant origins. They do not want to be identified as in relation to their parents' origins, national origins. So they do feel belonging to French society, to Germany, to Italy. That's something very important, and we still send them to the origins of their parents. So they are on the way of becoming citizens. So this citizenship, but without giving up Muslim difference. Indeed, the way they also recover or reappropriate Muslim religious markers are quite different from their parents. So it's something new, because the conditions of migration create a rupture, a discontinuity in terms of learning religion, in terms of transmission of religion. So the ways these Muslim third, second generation of Muslims are living their fate is quite different. They are innovating on the basis of everyday life, the way of becoming, the way how to live their religion in a European secular context. So it's not a linear process of integration, but we are at the stage of a certain integration. That's why I call it post-migratory phase, that the problems arise. Not because it's a problem, but on the contrary, those Muslims who are already successful in their integration create these series of controversies. Why? Because the first generation was very discreet in the ways they expressed their religious difference. They kept it at home. They didn't show it publicly. So the second, third generation, post-migratory phase, they have enough confidence as being citizens of those countries to manifest their religious difference, markers of their identity publicly. And this is Hannah Arendt's term. Citizenship is your capacity also, not having ID cards, but also having the courage in everyday life to show your difference, without being scared of keeping it at home. So this public life, that's why this publicness is very important, publicly visible. These are not, I'm not speaking of Muslim minorities as visible minorities, like a category of race, although they are also visible minorities, but they are actively visible minorities. They are active minorities. This is Serge Moscovici, a social psychologist in the 80s, who have coined this term for women, feminist movement. how women became active minorities. That is, they are transforming their conditions of life, their subjectivities, actively into a group of minority. It's not only a way of living it as a number, but it is a kind of active appropriation of this situation, which is neither in conformity with Islamic patriarchal norms, nor in conformity with feminist secular norms. That becomes a problem. So this assertive religious difference makes I would say, makes Muslims to be more publicly visible. This assertiveness that's not being discreet is perceived sometimes as being aggressive, political, ideological, and not just an issue of faith. So we can ask first the question, when a religious symbol becomes visible? Visibility is a relation of power. When it becomes visible to us, it becomes visible when we ask questions, when it is foreign to us, when we think it's alien, we are not familiar with. There's a spatial transgression. Boundaries are transgressed. When it is working class covering, it wasn't a debate, neither in France nor in Germany. Nobody has seen or noticed the working class headscarf, the headscarf of working class people, or the grandmothers. It becomes visible when it is the young students in high schools who are covering themselves, or the teachers in German schools with the headscarf, then it becomes visible. So there is a transgression of boundaries. But that transgression is also indicating a upward social mobility. They are succeeding in public schools. They are succeeding in their professional careers. But it becomes a problem for the public perception. So there's subjectivity on the one hand, agency of these women, but also public perception on the other hand. So we need a readjustment of that. And that readjustment is not easy, because normally in the European countries, the secular belief, secularization, meant, in spite of the differences among countries, we always speak of French exceptionalism, but I don't think it's so exceptional in these terms. We believe that religion should be in the private. It should be regulated. It should be private. It's as if something very abstract. It's in your minds or at home. But religion is also something very public. And it is also embodied. It is related with bodily practices. You cover yourself. It's something very personal. It is corporal. It's same with dietary habits. It's same with praying. Sabah Mahmoud, who we lost very recently, a very well-known anthropologist on Islam, she has shown how much religious rituals is important to understand as the embodiment of faith. Faith is not something, a belief, but it's also embodied practice. You survey, you control your faith. It's not something you have it once for all on your paper. So these embodied practices, like dietary habits, praying, covering, bring forth all the controversies in European societies. And as I said, this requires a readjustment between Muslim subjectivities, what they think about their own faith, and how the public perceives them. You can say in a simple way, well, this would mean recognition. We need to recognize the difference, religious practices of another religion. But this also means this creates a destructive effect in the established norms of a given society. That is, Muslim presence is not something only to be recognized, but also requires a two-way transformation. Somebody has asked for the first panel, have mentioned, we cannot take norms as given, but norms are changing. So the fact that Muslim women are covering themselves and yet following emancipatory trajectories of life in terms of education, going out of the house, nevertheless questions the secular feminist way of emancipation. So if we think in that terms, so it's not only passive recognition, but two-way change, which makes it very difficult. So the recognition of these women failed. I go fast. Recognition of Muslim women's covering, I would say, failed, because now we have everywhere laws and things. And especially it failed not only by state politics, but also by spokespersons of one kind of feminism who denied agency of Muslim women. They didn't recognize the agency that is embedded in covering yourself. So now, after 20 years of debate on headscarf, still the name is problematic. When we don't know how to relate ourselves with a difference, we try to invent names. We go back to the sources. Burqa, hijab, as if Arabic origins or other origins would give us the key, or it's nearby. It is in Europe. Burkini, in that matter, is a very good example. I love burkini. Because burkini is something now you cannot go back to Arab origins. It is a beach culture, and it's an accommodation, quite creative by a form. And still, maybe some of you have seen it. Last summer, there was a big scandal over burkini and how a woman with a burkini can go to a beach. So, beach, do they belong to a beach? Muslim women, or beach belongs to a Muslim woman? I mean, now we don't have the guardians, but we have policemen. So this is the question I'm asking. Do we have to share the same norms to belong? Is the condition of citizenship means conformity with established norms? And today the secularity or secularism plays the role of reifying these norms, including feminist, sexual minorities becoming like a norm, as compulsory, as something that people has to pass a test in order to be citizen. Not only within the country, but also before, I think it was in Netherlands, you will help me in the next maybe panel, there was a film showing some kind of manners in sexual ways quite free to see if the people who are asking to come to be migrant can be tolerant with these values. So our democracies are becoming very sexual democracies in a way. And so the question of if you are in conformity or not with the norms are becoming a very important element of the political culture, public culture of European countries in the last 20 years, with the ways in which they have framed the question of Islam. It became a question of norm, hierarchy of norms. I can say it in different ways. I can say the way we have thought in the Western countries of difference is either in terms of religious minority rights, basically more right-wing people, or multiculturalism. So two ways of thinking, two frames of thinking, both multiculturalism and religious rights, religious minority rights, do not apply today. So we do not, they fall short, they have been criticized. So we do not know how to address this issue. Second example I would like to give, and then I'll go quick to finish, is an example that is more incongruous, because it is circumcision of male, young male, not women, young male in the family. It is an interesting example because, again, this was raised in the first panel, not gender-only straight women, more straight than Muslim women cannot be. And so circumcision of male, that was another controversy which happened. It's a religious marker. It can't be publicly visible, but it can be a public issue when there was a medical problem in a case in Cologne, in Germany now. And it was in 2010. And it became a very important debate in the court. Regional court decided to forbid the circumcision of young boys with the argument that it is the violation of physical integrity of the young boys. Of course, well, this is the irony of history. It's quite sad, but Germany, who has done so important work in relation to the past that we haven't done in other parts of the world, like in Turkey. So although they have done this work of memory in relation to Holocaust, they have just forgotten that circumcision was a religious ritual that concerned Jewish community as well. Of course, that triggered a terrible anxiety within the Jewish community because it was also framed as the most archaic tradition that doesn't have its place in German society. And forbidding circumcision for targeting Muslim population meant also it brought in the Jewish circumcision in the picture. So Jewish society, Jewish community reacted. They have transformed with the help of Merkel the law. I don't go into details. But what is interesting in that example, it's also belonging, because is it a religious ritual? It is also a belonging between a father and the son, because it's a way of identification, both in Judaism and in Islam, although there are differences, because it's not a Quranic principle in the case of Islam, but it's an Abrahamic tradition, and it is a prophetic tradition, so it became a custom, very important custom, and it's a rite of passage. Rite of passage. So you belong to Muslim community, both for Muslim and Jewish male. It is a distinctive trait of Muslim man. Of course, I know in the States it has no such distinctive trait, but in the past and still, it is an ongoing debate. Circumcision as a kind of sense of belonging within the family, but also it concerns women. Can women be married with a non-circumcised man? So again, the question of belonging can come up in ways that we don't think about it and bring not only how Muslim population is acknowledged by laws and regulations, but also it brings in the relationship to Judeo-Islamic traditions. So whether Europe will be more Judeo-Christian or Judeo-Islamic, because there are many familiarities. Maybe I would leave it here because I'm seeing Samantha preparing her notes. I can just leave it on the circumcision issue and Judeo-Islamic, which creates more tension. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much. We were supposed to have a discussion back and forth, but I think there are so many amazing people out in the audience with, I'm sure, a very diverse set of views. And I urge you to step up to the microphone and either ask questions or offer feedback. While you're moving in that direction, and we have about 21 minutes for the discussion, I was struck in listening to both presentations just at while each are on very, in a sense, sort of nationally specific or community specific issues, but the universality of the dilemmas. So as you're speaking about activists, the even just imagining every day the choices that activists have to make in terms of how maximalist to be, given all of the gaps in terms of their rights and their rights enjoyment. Those dilemmas, I think, are universal and ones people here and elsewhere have grappled with. And then the questions on social norms. Before I came over, because I was cramming on immigration for the purposes of suddenly having to present, but I watched, I don't recommend this to anybody, but I watched the 2-minute welcome video that President Trump recorded not that long ago two people who were being naturalized at the naturalization ceremony. I do not recommend this viewing for anybody, but there was like a long time where it wasn't up, and this is something since George W. Bush, American presidents have at these ceremonies, which are very, very moving, where you take the oath and so forth. But a couple of the lines I actually wrote down, they just remind me of your presentation. He says nicely, no matter where you come from or what faith you practice, this country is now your country. So that was good. Go team, Team America. But then he to your point, he calls on naturalized citizens or newcomers to, quote, assimilate to our way of life, end quote, in just a very directive way. And I can't imagine, because this dilemma exists. The dilemma is real about assimilation and what did the melting pot mean? How much melting was required, or is it e pluribus unum? But I was very struck by how direct, and that who defines the our in our way of life. I'm stalling and filibustering in the hopes that people are going to step up to the microphone. I'm going to cold call people because we have such experts in the audience. If you're not careful, the old Socratic method will come. Okay, great. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, no problem. My name is Ryan. I'm a member of the public that I'm really grateful that you're open to the public. It's really great. I have so many questions. This is really, my father's a Muslim immigrant from the Middle East, so I'm really interested in a lot of these subjects. When you talked about nationality and citizenship in the Middle East and how that's not passed on from women, and even the last panel in America, it's very different. I had never really even thought of that, so that was awesome to hear about. But when I think of those issues in the Middle East specifically, I think of nationality, oppression, citizenship, things like that. I go to the Israeli-Palestinian issue and the occupied territories, where the Palestinians in many ways are already second-class citizens, and to go a further layer into that, the women in those territories, I was wondering if you, because you had so much knowledge about the whole area and the region with Human Rights Watch, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more specifically about those areas where most people aren't represented by the Israeli government, who kind of watches over them, and if you could speak to those specific people in those regions a little bit more.
Thank you. Great. Go ahead, sir. Well, I was going to take a few, but we don't have a very long line, so why don't you?
Okay.
And please, I encourage people to join the discussion. Don't be shy. Go ahead, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Dipali, and I'm a grad student in gender and migration at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. And I was just wondering if either of you could talk a little bit about how, one, you advocate for LGBTQ communities in the Middle East and North Africa, and as well as what you think how identity changes or how you practice identity changes in terms of migrating to Europe. Thank you.
Excellent.
On the first question, are you asking about the status of Palestinian women in the occupied Palestinian territories specifically? Yeah, well, the law that governs them depends on whether they live in the West Bank and East Jerusalem or Gaza, because if they live, then they have either British law that was in place at the time, or they have Ottoman law that was in place at the time prior to the occupation. And these systems of law, mostly penal code, but also family law, have actually not been amended or updated. So they're actually much more outdated than the laws in Egypt or Morocco or other places where there have been more regular updatings of the family laws and the penal codes and so forth. And so in many ways, they retain many of the most regressive features, one of which, for example, is the marry a rapist provision. That allows rapists to marry their victims. And I should say that most of these cases that we've seen of marry a rapists, just to not terrify people, are statutory rape cases, often boyfriend-girlfriend cases where technically it's rape, and now that the teenage daughter typically has been defiled, then they want to marry her off, and the boy can be prosecuted as a rapist, and so rather than go to jail, they marry them off and so forth. But in other cases, it actually is a 14-year-old girl forced to marry her rapist because now she's damaged goods and unwanted. And in fact, I remember interviewing a young girl in Libya many years ago who was in jail because she refused to marry her rapist. And there you have it. In other ways, there's a big domestic violence problem without a domestic violence law, and women do need consent to marry. Various other provisions that are relics of these very outdated penal code systems. But one of the things that's interesting, and whenever we've taken on women's issues in the occupied Palestinian territories, and has taken a lot of pushback, and sometimes it's very real, is that local activists don't want to prioritize women's issues because they say the occupation is the #1 issue, and all of the ills of society, it's sort of the kick your dog syndrome. You're oppressed, so you kick your dog, or you kick your wife, are a result of the occupation, and having to grapple with that. And in fact, there were times when we actually had prepared a report on domestic violence and spousal abuse and so forth, and we had to continually delay releasing the report because there was another war and another conflict, and you can't drop a report on domestic violence, whether in Egypt or in Palestine, when people are being slaughtered in the streets. And the dilemma that we always have in the Middle East, now sadly in so many countries, is that women's rights issues become deprioritized. We had a major campaign we were going to launch on child marriage in Yemen. There used to be a law prohibiting child marriage. It was overturned. Mass epidemic of child marriage in Yemen. And we just had to put it on the cold burner because of this horrible war there. Nobody has the attention span for these issues or the capability to address them.
Maybe the LGBT issue?
Yeah, the LGBT issue. I'm glad you raised that. I mean, it's not, in ways a women's issue. When I started at Human Rights Watch 15 years ago, the unwritten rule was we don't talk about LGBT issues in the Middle East unless it's through the lens of another problem. So we wouldn't talk about persecution of gays or lesbians. We would talk about torture. Oh, and by the way, in this case, it's gay people who are being tortured. Or police abuse. Oh, and by the way, it's transgender women in Kuwait who are being burned and assaulted by police. That's changed. That's changed a lot, and we've taken our cues from the local LGBT movements that have emerged, local LGBT activists that have emerged in many places across the Middle East. Few, not many, most of them are individual activists, such that this year, for the first time this month, we're launching a report and a series of videos that will target the LGBT youth community from interviews, over 80 interviews with LGBT activists, celebrities, artists, singers, musicians from across the Middle East, speaking in Arabic, speaking in their country's dialect, addressing some of the problems of LGBT communities, but basic things like you're not sick. Actually, it's not a disease to be LGBT, which is what people have heard. Or you can be a Muslim and LGBT. Or you have rights under human rights law. Your government may not know that yet, but you do. So we are very directly, frontally taking on the rights of the LGBT community in the Middle East because we think also the time is right for it. Society is right for it. The youth bulge in the Middle East is real. 70% of the population of the Middle East is under the age of 18 or 25. I'm getting the number wrong, but things are and will continue to rapidly change on these fronts.
We have now a wonderful line. I wanted to just share one little very briefly anecdote from my time as UN ambassador. We strove over the course of the 8 years in the Obama administration to promote LGBT rights internationally, including in areas that were quite sort of legendarily hostile on the ground to these rights and these individuals. And one of my ambitions was to somehow find a way to get LGBT rights onto the agenda of the UN Security Council, which is the kind of premier decision-making body at the UN. And when ISIS struck and began to take territory, one of the many forms of terror that it inflicted was on the subset of LGBT people, forcing gay men depicted on video, basically, to pushing them off buildings and killing them, or forcing them to jump themselves. And it was so horrific, and I went to my Security Council partners, both from the Middle East and well beyond, and said, look, we should do a Security Council meeting on this. We've done everything to do with ISIS. We've done ISIS and the Yazidis. We've done ISIS and sexual violence against women and sexual trafficking. We've done ISIS and cultural artifacts. You're telling me we can do things, which are very, very important, and not do like this subset of people? And basically everybody said, yes. In fact, But we did it, and we did it in part because this is within the UN, a very different setting than doing the real work that Sarah's doing on the ground. But we did it because we were able to partner with the Chilean government, so it wasn't a US-led effort. And we didn't do it in the formal chamber of the Security Council, but we did what's called an ARIA meeting. It was the first meeting in 70 years of the Security Council on the fate of any LGBT population. But the Trojan horse we needed was ISIS, which is the one thing everyone could agree was completely terrible, to your point about torture and so forth. Let's just take the string of comments or questions, and then the panel. Thank you.
Hi. My name is Natalie Hamilton. I'm from Franklin Pierce University, and this question is for Sarah. So you spoke a little bit about the promising reforms coming from your activists, and I wanted to know if you could speak a little bit about the risks your activists face, and if you see a difference that the risks face between the women in your organization and the Saudi women strictly.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. We're going to just take all of you because we don't have a ton of time. We want to hear all the voices.
Thank you. My name is Ludmila Bogdan. I'm a postdoc, and I study human trafficking. And to a large degree, I deal with victims of human trafficking. And many of anti-trafficking campaigns are very similar to the one we saw, the Human Rights Watch, if I'm not mistaken. And I don't know if everyone else, but there was a striking difference between what Human Rights Watch did with this campaign, as opposed to the campaigns who came from the region. The first one was where you see bruised women, beaten, immobile. And in the second one, the one that came from the women from the region, I think it was more empowering, the one that said, like, I'm my own guardian. So I'm wondering if, like, your organization is actually thinking more in doing some campaigns to empower women. Because from my own research, dealing with victims of human trafficking, that backfires. Many people don't want to identify themselves as victims because they don't like the images they see. So I would like to have your comments on this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your work on trafficking. Yes.
Hello. My name is Madeline. I'm a gender and women's studies student from the University of Rhode Island, and my question is for Sarah. At the beginning of your remarks, you talked about you listed a bunch of new legislation in place to protect women who come forward about sex crimes and domestic violence, and I'm just wondering if you know how likely law enforcement is to actually act on that and to protect the victims who come forward about it, because I know in a lot of African countries there are laws against rape and against domestic violence, but those who come forward about it are like law enforcement is super unlikely to investigate it, or let alone like lead to a prosecution. So I'm just wondering.
And maybe just along with that, because that was one of the questions I was going to ask too, but the tactic of going for the legal changes, is that because everything else is so amorphous, or is there just a notion that law, it may not correlate, or it may not be causal initially, but like what's your empirical basis for taking that approach versus some others? Is it sort of all you have? Yes.
Yeah, my name is Aneri Miranda, and I was really struck by what you had to say about second-generation Muslims kind of transforming their subjectivities and becoming more visible, and it seemed like you attributed that to their kind of success. And as a second-generation Latina, I think kind of about the universality of that, and how here I do see a certain visibility among us too, but I have attributed it not so much to our success, and maybe that is the case, but also to kind of a reaching for identity. So my question's a little bit abstract, but I'm wondering the extent to which you kind of see that visibility as even just kind of a reaching or a struggling with identity among second-generation Muslims.
Excellent, thank you.
Hello, I'm Rosaria Pisa. I'm the Director of Gender and Women's Studies at the University of Rhode Island. I want to thank all the panelists for a wonderful dialogue. The construct of multicultural citizenship model is very compelling in post-global, post-neoliberal, contemporary mass migration contexts. How can multicultural citizenship be achieved if the people who embody cultures of opposition to dominant national cultures or culture are typically disenfranchised as a result of their denial of citizenship rights and belonging. So how can we achieve such a model if the people most affected are not participating in the process, as I believe is the case in France? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, great. Okay, so we have 6 minutes left to tackle very broad and important questions, but maybe, Sarah, do you want to start? And then we'll
yeah, I guess very quickly, I'm sorry I won't give full answers to the good questions. In terms of activists and risk, I mean, yes, definitely. Activists who are on the ground and subject to the sovereignty of repressive states are the ones who face the most risk. Activists who have nationalities from elsewhere and can leave a country face less risk. That's the reality. So Saudi activists who a decade ago tried to challenge the driving ban by driving spent years in jail. Activists who were demanding the right to marry whom they wanted, even despite their guardian's opposition, spent years in jail. In fact, there were cases of women who were forcibly divorced from husbands they had managed to somehow secretly marry because their father didn't approve, and they spent years in jail. So the reality is, not just for women's rights activists, but any activists in regressive states and repressive states like Saudi Arabia face jail, if not worse. And that's actually one thing I did want to mention, and I would caution everyone to be very alert to, is the extent to which the Saudi government is now, I want to appropriate the term pinkwashing to also apply to pretending to be women's rights reformers as a way to wash an otherwise brutal, repressive record against your own citizens, not to mention the slaughter of Yemenis across the border. And that's why I was trying to emphasize the extent to which the reforms in Saudi Arabia started well before the current Crown Prince's administration and have been the product of the toil of women in Saudi Arabia over many, many years. And finally, by the way, none of the promised reforms in Saudi Arabia, specifically women driving, which I hope we'll see in June, but lifting of the guardianship, at least parts of it that the government has promised, none of that has actually happened yet. So please don't give them credit yet until they actually do what they've promised. In terms of the empowerment and the videos and so forth, I just want to emphasize again that these videos are a product of our work with Saudi activists who played a tremendous role in deciding what the themes of the videos should be, how the women should appear, the fact that they were animated videos, the dialect in the videos, the language of the videos. This was crafted by Saudi women and activists, so this was not our creation, and that was pretty much the point of my presentation. Enforcement of laws, you know, when people say what's wrong with the Middle East, and I see corporations like my former employer, Goldman Sachs, spending tons of money on women's empowerment to help women get jobs and fix their resumes and so forth, you know, that's all great and good, but you can only get so far when the laws of the country are against you. They're actually designed to disempower you and to harm you. And because states have actually agreed to certain human rights obligations, we have something to actually pin them on and hold them to. While social and cultural norms and changes, for example, seeing a housemaid in my house as an employee and not my slave or my semi-daughter slave or my semi-child slave, which are ways that they've often perceived, is a long cultural project, and we undertake it. But the fixes that can be immediate are the changes in law that say every domestic worker has to have a day off, or a woman can get married to whomever she wants without anyone's permission. And so the problem is the laws. You know, whether the new laws are enforced, that's a next step. But first, let's actually get rid of the laws that restrict and discriminate and harm and destroy the lives of women in the region.
Great. And I think 2 questions for you.
Yeah, thank you for the identity question. That's very true. It's not only the success which leads to that, but the identity search only can be possible if these people already are mastering the languages, the communication codes, they are already integrated into the system, because otherwise it's not possible just to build up your identity. And the identities in question are always not binary, but being hyphenated identities, as we say, Latino American or Muslim European. But this hyphen is very complicated. That's what I'm saying. It's becoming more and more complicated in the actual political situation. that is related with the second question I would like to go. It is not the multicultural citizenship as a project that really influences the political cultures of the Western democracies. On the contrary, we shifted everywhere from the celebration of minorities, hyphenated identities, to a kind of culture of majority making. And we were speaking about cultural relativism, multiculturalism, sometimes in critique of cultural relativism. Today we speak of the hierarchy of values, so assimilation to an American way of life, but the same even in very liberal Great Britain, and the same in France. So identity issue is becoming more and more, unfortunately, not the minorities, but the majority making kind of instrument. So when French started to discuss who are we, as French, I started to be scared, you know, and this is the kind of thing. And now we see, although in France, they didn't move into that illiberal democracy, but in many places of Europe, we see how illiberal democracies are growing. And I just wanted to a bit turn the gaze to us and not to have always this certitude, the certainty in relation to women's rights. When we speak about the Middle East, we always know what to do. But when we look at the free women and living in Europe, and there it becomes much more problematic when we turn the gaze to ourselves. So that's also what I wanted to question. And in the case of maybe international organizations, we need also kind of vernacular languages rather than having one language spreading from the West to the other parts of the world. I think it's inevitable maybe, but even LGBTI, you know, even knowing how to pronounce it gives you some kind of power. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. This was fantastic. Thank you both. I do think to end on a more upbeat note, you know, no more than we can look simply to women, whether in our democracies or around the world, to promote women's rights. There's a big part of the equation lies in, of course, in the hands and the will of men. So too, I think on the question of multicultural citizenship, it would be unfair and unwise to rely on the multiplicity of cultures and those people who are being denied or subjected to injustice to look out for their rights on their own. And fundamentally, I think that's the point you just made. You know, it's going to be incumbent on the majority and on people, again, who don't face the same struggle to bring the kind of solidarity that true citizenship, I think, entails. So thank you all. It's a pleasure, and I urge everybody to come to this unbelievable keynote reading and conversation where we have two of my favorite writers on planet Earth here at 2 p.m., and then the panel in the afternoon, The Gendered Politics of New Nationalisms. So great afternoon ahead for Radcliffe. Thank you.